Good evening, welcome back. Or, if this is your first night here, welcome. You've picked an interesting night to arrive. This is the sleepy history of medicine. Long, quiet documentaries about how human beings have tried to heal each other, told slowly in the dark at the pace of a fireside story. Nothing is required of you for the next 2 hours. Nothing will be on the test. If you drift off somewhere between ancient Athens and a Victorian courtroom, you'll have used this exactly as directed. You know this shop by now. We've spent 3 long nights in it, among the jars and the drawers, the laudanum and the liver pills, the brass scale that settles arguments to within a grain. But tonight, for the first time, we're not stopping at the friendly shelves. Tonight we walk past them, all the way to the back, to the corner behind the counter where the light doesn't quite reach. There's a cupboard there, and it's locked. Behind its glass, the bottles are different from the others. Green and cobalt blue and ribbed, ridged with deep vertical flutes, so that even in the dark, even half asleep, even reaching with a candle in your other hand, your fingers would know them and stop. There's a drawer below with a little bell mounted on it, so that no one, not even the chemist, can open it silently. And there is a book. You've seen the book twice before in this series, the ledger where your name went if you bought what this cupboard holds. Tonight, at last, is the night we open it properly. Every episode so far has been about the healing half of the shelf. But the oldest word in the series, pharmacon, remedy and poison, both at once, has always had another half. And a history of medicine that never looked it in the eye would be a polite lie. So tonight, the poisons and the poisoners, and this is the important part, the reason the story can still carry you gently to sleep, the long, patient, quietly triumphant story of how medicine learned to catch them. Because this is not a horror story. It's a detective story, the slowest and grandest one ever run. It takes 4,000 years. The detectives are chemists and pharmacists and one very stubborn Spaniard with a laboratory in Paris, and by the final chapter, the poisoners lose. So settle in. Let your shoulders sink. The cupboard is locked. The bell is quiet, and nothing in this room can reach you, which is, as you'll hear, exactly the point of the whole story. Chapter 1: The Other Half of the Word. We have to begin in the garden, because the poisons did. Walk back into the physic garden we visited in episodes past. The neat beds, the lead markers, the lavender and the poppies and the willow by the wall. Every plant in this garden is here because it does something to a human body. That has been the admission criterion for 4,000 years. And that means this garden was always going to have a darker bed, not fenced off in the old days, not even labeled at first. growing right there among the remedies, because the ancient gardeners understood something we spent all of our last episode learning. The difference between the two beds was never really about the plants. Consider the residence. There is hemlock, a tall, ferny, innocent-looking thing with white lace flowers and purple spotted stems, a cousin of carrots and parsley, which is precisely what has made it dangerous for all of recorded history. There is aconite, whose hooded blue flowers are so handsome that gardeners still grow it on purpose, monkshood, wolfsbane, called by the ancients the queen of poisons, and treated by them with the wariness the title suggests. There is hellebore, the black and the white, which classical medicine used as its great drastic purge, the remedy you reached for when nothing gentler would move, and which sat exactly on the border between cure and calamity, dose by dose. There is the yew, planted in 10,000 churchyards, every part of it dangerous except the one red orel the birds eat, a tree the ancients already knew to respect and the moderns would one day tap for a cancer drug, because nothing in this episode stays in its assigned bed. There is even our old friend the mandrake, whose screaming root legend we enjoyed debunking in the apothecary episode, growing here on its dark bedside. And there is a low, quietly glossy plant, with dull purple bells and berries like black cherries, of which more, much more, in a moment, because its name contains an entire history of civilization in 4 syllables. The Greeks, who gave us pharmacon, did not pretend this bed wasn't there. They walked straight into it, took notes, and put the results into the most famous death scene in the ancient world. In the year 399 before our era, the city of Athens condemned the philosopher Socrates to die, and the method of execution was the city's standard one, a prepared cup of hemlock. What happened next we know, because his student Plato wrote it down in the closing pages of the Phaedo, and it is worth pausing on how Plato chose to tell it. Because of all the death scenes antiquity could have left us, this one is told with an almost unbearable calm. Socrates spends his last afternoon doing exactly what he had done every other afternoon, talking philosophy with his friends, teasing them for their grief. When the cup comes, he asks the man who brings it, politely, what one does, the way you or I might ask a pharmacist about a new prescription, drinks it without ceremony, and walks around the room as instructed, until his legs grow heavy. Then he lies down, and the numbness rises slowly from his feet, and he goes on talking, gently, for as long as talking remains to him. His last words are a small joke about owing a rooster to Asclepius, the Greek god of healing, the customary offering of a patient who had been cured, as though death itself were a recovery, and someone ought to pay the usual fee. We tell that scene, the only death we will watch closely all evening, because Plato told it first, and told it that way on purpose, quiet, unhurried, at the pace of a fireside story. And underneath its philosophy, notice what the scene actually documents, a state that could measure a poison, a prepared dose, a professional who knew the procedure, effects so well understood they could be narrated in advance like an itinerary. That is the dark bed of the garden, under full cultivation. Athens knew its hemlock the way it knew its olives, which is, depending on the hour of the night you think about it, either deeply chilling or strangely reassuring. The ancient world's knowledge of poison and its knowledge of medicine were the same knowledge, kept in the same heads, written on the same shelf. The word pharmacon wasn't being poetic, it was being precise. And because it was the same knowledge, it got the same scholarship. Here's a fact that pleases us more than almost anything else in tonight's episode. The first dedicated toxicology textbooks in the Western tradition, the founding documents of the science of poisons, are poems. In the 2nd century before our era, a Greek writer named Nicander composed 2 long works in verse, the theriac, on venomous creatures and what to do about their bites, and the alexipharmaca, on poisons and their antidotes, hexameters like Homer, hundreds of lines of vipers and scorpions and aconite and remedies, all set to meter. Scholars have argued ever since about how much practical use they were as medicine. Nicander is uneven at best, but as an artifact he is glorious. The study of poisons enters Western literature wearing its formal robes, recited aloud, presumably memorized by students the way students have always memorized things, by the swing of the lines. Somewhere in the 2nd century BC, in other words, a young man was learning the antidotes to a beat. We narrate a history of medicine to help people fall asleep. Nicander versified toxicology so it would stay learned. We consider him a colleague and his methods sound. Now, the glossy plant with the purple bells, because its name is the whole ancient bargain preserved in amber. The botanists call it Atropa belladonna, and both halves of that name are doing heavy work. Atropa is from Atropos, the third of the 3 fates, the sisters who spin, measure, and cut the thread of every human life. Atropos is the one with the shears. The 18th century naturalists who formalized the name knew exactly what they were saying. This is the plant of the scissors, the one that ends threads. And belladonna, beautiful lady, in Italian, remembers the plant's other career entirely, the Renaissance fashion, reported down the centuries, of women using drops prepared from the berries to widen the pupils of their eyes, because wide, dark, candlelit eyes were beautiful, and the plant, obliged. The same species, wearing both its names at once, the fate with the shears and the beautiful lady. And if you wanted tonight's entire episode in a single botanical label, there it is. Every culture that has ever kept this plant has known both of its faces. What changed across 4,000 years was never the plant. It was the bookkeeping around it. And medicine, mark this, never once managed to throw the dark bed out of the garden because it kept turning out to need it. Hellebore held its place in the pharmacopoeia for millennia. Aconite appears in the old prescription books in carefully hedged externals. And belladonna's active principle, the ancients could not have known this, but the shape of it would not have surprised them, sits in modern medicine still. The eye doctor who dilates your pupils for an examination is performing, with clinical exactness, the Venetian lady's trick. And an extract of the deadly nightshade family, atropine, rides in ambulances and hospital crash carts to this day, named for the fate with the shears and used, the old word insists on itself, as an antidote. The plant of the scissors, employed to uncut threads. Nothing on this shelf has ever agreed to be only one thing. So the ancient world closes its first chapter on poisons the way it closed its first chapter on remedies, with the same plants, the same careful books, the same wary respect, and no illusion whatsoever that the two subjects could be separated. What antiquity did not yet have, what it would take the rest of tonight to build, was any reliable way to prove, after the fact, that a poisoning had happened at all. A fever and a dose of aconite could look, at the graveside, remarkably alike, and where proof is impossible, fear moves in and furnishes the place. Nowhere did that fear live more lavishly than at the top, at the tables of kings who had the most to lose, the most enemies to lose it to, and the money to buy every antidote, real or imagined, that the ancient world could invent. Next, the taster, the unicorn's horn, the stone from a goat's stomach, and the paranoid king of Pontus who tried to make his own body poison-proof and gave his name to the attempt. Chapter 2. The King's Taster. If you want to know what the ancient world could not do about poison, don't read its medical books. Look at its dinner tables, the grand ones, the royal ones. Every strange object and stranger ritual on those tables is a confession. We cannot detect it, we cannot prove it, and so we will build a wall of ceremony and hope. Begin with the most human wall of all, another person. The taster is one of the oldest jobs in recorded history. The Romans had a word for the professional who sampled the emperor's dishes: the praegustator, the foretaster, and the great households organized them into staffs with foremen like any other domestic department. Medieval and Renaissance courts kept the institution going for another 1,000 years, elaborated into full liturgy. Dishes tasted in the kitchen, tasted again at the door, tasted a third time at the table, in view of the diner, by a servant whose continued good health was the course's certificate of quality. Stop and feel how strange that is, and how honest. The mightiest people on earth, dining nightly behind a screen of other people's bodies, not because it worked especially well, but because it was the only test anyone had. The laboratory would not enter the dining room for another 15 centuries. Until then, the assay instrument was a man standing by the sideboard swallowing, and the sideboard itself remembers. The testing of food and drink was called in the Italian courts the credenza, from the same root as credence and credo, the act of establishing belief, of making the dish believable. The testing was done at a side table, and the side table took the ceremony's name and kept it after the ceremony died, which is why, to this day, the long, low cabinet in a dining room where the serving dishes wait is called a credenza. There is a piece of furniture in 1,000,000 ordinary houses named for the fear of poison, and almost no one who polishes one knows it. History hides in the furniture. It always has. Where there is royal fear, there are luxury goods, and the antidote trade of the old courts was luxury retail at its most magnificent and least effective. The unicorn's horn stood at the top of the market, a long spiraled marvel, ground into cups and mounted in gold, believed to sweat or change color in the presence of poison, priced, literally, above its weight in gold, and possessed by every court that could manage one. It was, we now know, the tusk of the narwhal, harvested in northern seas, and traded south through a supply chain that had every incentive to keep the unicorn part going. And then there was the bezoar, a stone from the stomach of a goat or similar animal, a hard concretion of swallowed matter, worn smooth, mounted in filigree, dangled into wine cups on little golden chains. The word comes from Persian, padzar, against poison. And for centuries, the bezoar was exactly that. The universal antidote you could hold in your hand. Insurance in mineral form. Below the unicorn and the bezoar, the catalog only widened. There were toadstones, believed to grow in the heads of old toads, actually fossil fish teeth, set into rings that were supposed to heat or sweat at poison's approach. There was powdered coral and hung amulets of it for children. There were cups of supposed serpent's horn and rhinoceros horn. There was terra sigillata, the sealed earth of Lemnos, which you'll remember from our apothecary episode, pressed into pastilles and swallowed as universal armor. An entire luxury economy, in short, of objects whose single shared property was that none of them worked, and all of them sold for centuries to the least gullible and best advised people in Europe, which tells you everything about how fear shops. It fell to a surgeon we should all be fonder of, Ambroise Paré, the great plain-spoken Frenchman of the 16th century, to ask the obvious question out loud: does any of this actually work? The story, as Paré himself tells it, is brief and grim, and we will keep it brief. In 1567, offered a chance to test a celebrated bezoar, he proposed the era's version of a clinical trial, a condemned prisoner, a poison, the stone. And the stone failed completely. Paré reported the failure in print, with the surgeon's shrug that made him famous. The bezoar, he concluded, was worth nothing against poison, whatever the goldsmith said. One experiment, one honest report, and the whole glittering antidote market shivered. It kept selling for another century, of course. Markets built on fear always outlive their debunking. But the modern reader recognizes the moment at once. That is the sound of evidence arriving, early, unwelcome, and correct. But the greatest antidote story of antiquity is a king. The one man who decided that if no cup and no stone could be trusted, he would make the antidote out of himself. Mithridates VI, king of Pontus, on the Black Sea coast of what is now Turkey, spent his long life at war with Rome, and, if the ancient accounts are to be believed, and here as everywhere tonight they should be believed cautiously, at war with poison. The tradition says his father was poisoned at a banquet, that his own mother's regency made the palace unsafe, that the young prince fled to the wilderness for years and returned with a project. The project made his name immortal, Mithridates, the accounts say, set out to armor his own body, taking minute doses of poisons, gradually, over years, until they could not touch him, while his court physicians compounded for him a universal antidote of dozens of ingredients, refined continually, tested, the dark mirror of Pare's honesty, on condemned prisoners. The antidote was called Mithridatium, after him. And you have met it before. It was the direct ancestor of theriac, the 64-ingredient imperial cure-all we spent a chapter with in episode 1 and have never quite escaped since. Andromachus, Nero's physician, built theriac by revising the recipe of Mithridates. The most famous medicine of the next 17 centuries began life as a paranoid king's poison insurance. How much of the story is true? The careful answer, the king, the wars, the deep interest in pharmacology. Solid. Ancient sources agree he was a genuine scholar of poisons and antidotes, a collector of remedies and of languages. The graduated self-dosing, the practice that still bears his name, Mithridatism, rests on ancient tradition rather than proof, polished into legend by every retelling, ours now included. But the ending, as the Romans told it, is too perfectly shaped to leave out. We told it once in our first episode, and it has lost nothing in the interval. We flag it, as always, as the traditional telling. Defeated at last, cornered by rebellion in his own family, the old king tried to end his life with poison, and it would not work. The armor held when he no longer wanted it. He died, instead, the story goes, by a soldier's sword at his own request. The Romans loved that ending, and you can see why. It is the whole logic of the pharmacon folded into a single scene. The remedy and the poison, the protection and the trap, revealed at the last to be the same thing. Whether it happened quite that way, 20 centuries of retellers have declined to check too closely. Some stories are kept for what they teach rather than what they prove, and this one has been teaching the same lesson since Rome. There is no armoring yourself against your own shelf. And one detail is documented, and it is the best one. When Pompey finally overran the king's palace, among the treasures he shipped back to Rome were Mithridates' private notebooks, his recipes, his poison lore, his antidote formulas, which the Romans had translated, studied, and folded into their own medicine. The greatest enemy of Rome conquered, and his pharmacology looted like statuary. Knowledge on this shelf has never respected a border in its life. So the courts of the old world dined behind their tasters, drank past their dangling stones, and slept a little easier for a recipe descended from a dead king's paranoia. And none of it, not one item in the whole glittering kit, could do the one thing that actually mattered. Prove afterward in daylight that a poisoning had occurred. That failure had a price, and the next chapter pays it. Because where proof is impossible, accusation becomes unanswerable. And in the most powerful households of Rome, where every convenient death improved somebody's inheritance, the accusations began to fly and stuck and became the history books we still read. Next, the empire that wrote the first great poison law, the empresses' history convicted without evidence, and the professional poisoner whose name became a legend on the strength of sources who hated everyone involved. Chapter 3, Locusta's Rome. Rome took poison seriously before it took almost anything else seriously. In the year 81 before our era, while the Republic still stood, a generation before the Caesars, the dictator Sulla enacted the Lex Cornelia de Sicariis et Veneficiis, the Cornelian law on stabbers and poisoners. Read that pairing again, because it is the whole Roman view in 5 words. The man with a dagger and the person with a vial, one statute, same crime, same penalty. It is among the first comprehensive poison laws in the Western record, and it stayed on the books, cited and elaborated for centuries, covering not only the poisoning itself, but the making, buying, selling, and possessing of the stuff with intent. The Romans, in other words, had grasped the supply chain. 4,000 years of pharmacy regulation. Every schedule, every register, every locked cupboard in this series descends in spirit from that one Republican statute. The law arrived on this shelf remarkably early. Proof, however, did not. And Rome with a poison law, but no poison test, turned out to be a very particular kind of dangerous, mostly, it must be said, to reputations. The Republic had already run the experiment centuries before Sulla, and the result deserves its own quiet minute. In the year 331 before our era, so the historian Livy records, writing 300 years after the fact, Rome suffered a season of unexplained deaths among its leading men, and a servant informed the authorities that the city's matrons were brewing the cause. A house was raided. Women were found, the story goes, over their kettles. The preparations they insisted were medicines they were invited to drink and did, and died. And the affair widened until, the numbers Livy's, some 170 matrons stood condemned. It is the first mass poisoning trial in the Western record, and here's the detail that makes it belong to this series. Livy himself doesn't quite believe it. He passes the story along, as he says, as he found it, but adds that some of his sources thought the deaths were plague, and the poisonings, a panic dressed in charges, and he leaves the reader to weigh a pestilence against a conspiracy of housewives. Read that again across 22 centuries. The very first entry in the poison trial ledger arrives already flagged by its own historian as a possible epidemic wearing a prosecution. Disease we cannot see, blame we can. It is the oldest exchange rate in this episode, and Rome fixed it early. By the time of the emperors, the exchange had professionalized. The Lex Cornelia gave the charge teeth. The imperial treason courts gave it wings. Under Tiberius and his successors, poisoning accusations traveled in company with treason and adultery charges as the standard kit for destroying the prominent, pressed by the delatories, the professional informers who earned a cut of the condemned's estate. Note the incentive structure with a modern shudder. Men paid on commission, prosecuting a crime that could not be tested, before courts that read conviction as loyalty, The wonder of the Julio-Claudian poison files is not how many entries they contain. It is that anyone still expects to find the truth in them. Here we must have a small, friendly talk about sources, because this chapter walks through the most poisonous stretch of gossip in ancient literature, and we are not going to walk through it naively. Nearly everything anyone knows about poisoning in the imperial household comes from three writers: Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, all writing generations after the events, all drawing on the rumor mills of a capital that ran on rumor, and all with axes lovingly ground. When an inconvenient Caesar died of illness, the whisper was poison. When the whisper suited a later historian's portrait of a scheming empress, it was written down as near fact. And at 2,000 years' distance, the whisper and the fact have fused. The Empress Livia, wife of Augustus, was accused by rumor of clearing the succession with poisoned figs. Modern historians largely shrug. No evidence, famous story. And so, in the year 54, we come to the most celebrated dish in Roman history. The Emperor Claudius, dead after a plate of mushrooms. His wife Agrippina inheriting the empire for her son Nero. Tacitus says poison. Administered. Tradition adds, with the help of a convicted poisoner fetched from prison for the occasion. Was it? The honest answer. And it is the answer this entire episode keeps circling. Nobody could prove it then, and nobody can prove it now. Claudius was elderly, a famous glutton, and mushrooms, as any modern poison control pharmacist will tell you with feeling, are quite capable of killing without anyone's assistance. The innocent and the deadly species can look alarmingly alike in a sauce. The verdict of history was written by authors who despised Agrippina. She may well have done it. She was convicted, so to speak, without a test, and that is precisely the point of this chapter. In a world without proof, the poisoning trial happens in literature. The sentence is eternal, and the appeal is never heard. The woman fetched from prison, tradition says, was Locusta, and she is the strangest figure in tonight's episode. History's most famous professional poisoner, about whom history knows almost nothing for certain. What the sources give us is this: a woman, apparently from Gaul, held in Rome on poisoning charges, whose expertise was considered a resource worth keeping alive, employed, say Tacitus and Suetonius, in the deaths of Claudius and the following year of the young Prince Britannicus, poisoned, the story goes, at the family dinner table while Nero watched, rewarded by Nero afterward with pardon, estates, and the detail every retelling loves best, pupils sent to her to learn the trade as though she ran an academy of the art. And then, when Nero fell and Galba swept the capital clean, executed among the relics of the old regime. That is nearly the whole file. The school of poisoning may be embellishment. The very name, Locusta, the locust, the devourer, sits so neatly on a professional poisoner that one wonders whether we are reading a biography or a stage name or a slander. She has become, in the long retelling, less a person than a job description with a face. The state's poisoner, the palace's dark pharmacist, the proof that the knowledge on the shelf could be salaried. Suetonius adds one last flourish to the file, and we pass it along with the usual customs declaration. Nero, he says, took a preparation of Locustas in a golden box with him into the gardens as his reign collapsed around him. And yet when the actual end came, a panicked night later at a freedman's villa outside the city, the box was nowhere at hand, and the emperor ended matters with a blade and a servant's help instead. The emperor who commissioned the age's finest poisons died unable to reach one. If that ending sounds suspiciously like the Mithridates ending with the polarity reversed, the armored king whom poison refused, the poisoning emperor who mislaid his, you have discovered how Roman moralists built their anecdotes, and you may award yourself a very drowsy diploma. And notice, one plain sentence, because it will echo down every remaining chapter of tonight, who the accusation of poisoning attached itself to in Rome and for the next 18 centuries. Women, foreigners, servants, and anyone else the age considered close to the kitchen and far from the sword. Poison was called the coward's weapon and the woman's weapon by cultures that reserved every other weapon for men. And the accusation, unfalsifiable in a world without chemistry, was itself a weapon that never missed. Some of the accused, no doubt, were poisoners. Many were merely convenient. Until the laboratory arrives, we will rarely be able to say which was which. And Rome's poisoning history is best read not as a record of crimes, but as a record of fears filed by the fearful against the people they already feared. What Rome bequeathed, then, was double. The first great legal machinery against poisoning, and the first great demonstration of what that machinery does when it runs without evidence. It burns reputations for fuel. The empire's poison stories traveled into the medieval imagination essentially unedited, and Europe absorbed both the fear and the template, the suspect death, the whispered name, the trial by narrative. All the template lacked was a setting worthy of it. And the Renaissance, with its courts and its banquets, its brilliant chemistry and its more brilliant slander, was about to provide the most operatic setting the poison legend ever enjoyed. Next, the family whose very name became a synonym for the art, the republic that kept poisoning on its actual books, and the queen, who was convicted by 3 centuries of historians on the evidence of a pair of gloves. Chapter 4. The Italian Art. By the age of Shakespeare, the English language had quietly done something remarkable. It had made Italian an adjective for poisoning. On the London stage, where the revenge tragedies played, the poisoner was Italian as reliably as the ghost was pale. Italian courts, Italian vials, Italian subtlety. The playwrights sent their plots to Italy the way later centuries would send them to shadowy foreign capitals, because the audience arrived pre-convinced that this was simply what Italians did. How does an entire nation acquire a reputation like that? Tonight's answer comes in 3 parts. One famous family that mostly didn't earn it, one sober government that absolutely did, and one queen who carried the reputation abroad in her luggage and was billed for it by history ever after. The family first, because you have been waiting for them since the episode began. The Borgias. Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI in 1492. His son Cesare tore across Italy as the model for Machiavelli's prince. His daughter Lucrezia was married 3 times into the peninsula's power politics before she was 22. That they played the era's power games with both hands, bribery, warfare, nepotism on a heroic scale, no historian disputes. But the poisonings, the famous dinners from which inconvenient cardinals did not return, and above all the legendary family recipe, la cantarella, the secret white powder whose formula supposedly died with them. Here the record grows suddenly, suspiciously thin. The cantarella has no surviving recipe, no contemporary chemical description, nothing but rumor compounding rumor, most of it recorded by the family's political enemies, and much of it after the family was safely dead. The deaths attributed to it were, in the sober reckoning, mostly fevers in a city where fevers did the majority of all dying, including, very possibly, Alexander's own. And Lucrezia, the poisoner princess of 100 novels and operas, the hollow ring dripping into wine glasses, has been substantially acquitted by modern scholarship. The documented Lucrezia was a capable Duchess of Ferrara, a patron of poets, dead at 39 in childbed like so many women of her age, convicted of nothing in her lifetime and everything afterward. The hollow poison ring itself, mark this, is a genre of artifact the 19th century adored collecting and attributing. The museums hold rings with secret compartments aplenty. What they mostly cannot prove is that any particular one held anything deadlier than a relic or a keepsake. The Borgia legend, in short, is the Agrippina problem from last chapter wearing Renaissance velvet, convicted by hostile narrators in the permanent court of literature without a test in sight. We file the cantarella gently on the shelf of stories too good to be true, where it sits, we must admit, very handsomely. And yet, this is the marvelous, uncomfortable turn. While the legend was inflating in one Italian city, the real thing was being minuted in another. Venice, the most bureaucratic state in Europe, ran its most sensitive business through the Council of 10, the small, secretive committee that handled state security. And the 10 kept records, because Venice kept records of everything. It is the most Venetian fact imaginable. In those archives, preserved to this day, historians have found the paper trail of state-considered poisoning, proposals received and debated, targets named including, famously, sultans of the Ottoman Empire, terms discussed, fees contingent on success, outcomes noted in the margins. Offers came in from freelancers the way inventors submit patents. Men with a poison and a plan, seeking a government contract. Some proposals the 10 declined. Some they funded. The votes were taken and the tallies survive. There is no lurid literature here, no hollow rings, no midnight legend. Just committee minutes in secretary's ink, treating assassination by poison as a line of state business alongside espionage and diplomacy. The terms were commercial to the last clause. Payment contingent on verified results, expenses considered, and in the files, the occasional petition from a practitioner seeking what can only be called a pension for services rendered. Somewhere between the legend of the Borgia dinner and the reality of a Venetian committee voting on an invoice lies the entire distance between how history feels and how it actually runs. It is the coldest material in tonight's episode precisely because it is the best documented and it teaches the rule this whole hour keeps enforcing. The poison stories history can actually prove tend to live not in the banquet scenes, but in the ledgers. And the flamboyant legends, the ones with recipes named like operas, tend to evaporate when you reach for the receipts. Remember that trade-off. The rest of the episode runs on it. The English, meanwhile, were building the legend a stage. It is hard to overstate how thoroughly the drama of Shakespeare's London ran on Italian poison. Hamlet's father dead by a vial in the ear, and the play closed by an envenomed cup and blade. The revenge tragedies of Webster and his colleagues, set in Italian courts where the candles themselves seemed toxic. And, closest to this series' heart, the apothecary of Romeo and Juliet, the gauntest figure in the canon, a starving Mantuan shopman, his shelves dressed with empty boxes and old cakes of roses, who sells Romeo the fatal dram with the most honest line any pharmacist ever spoke on a stage, "My poverty, but not my will, consents." Shakespeare, whose eye missed nothing, put his finger precisely where this whole episode lives. The law forbade the sale, the shelf contained the thing, and the gap between them was exactly the width of a starving man's need. The playhouses taught 2 generations of Englishmen that poison spoke Italian, and the audience walked home past London chemists' windows stocked with arsenic and never thought to write a tragedy about that. The costume, as ever, was foreign. The shelf was local. Which brings us to the Queen with the gloves. Catherine de' Medici left Florence in 1533 at 14 to marry into the French royal house and eventually governed France as Queen Mother through the blood-soaked decades of its religious wars. She brought Italian cooks, Italian perfumers, Italian fashions, and, said her enemies, the Italian art. The story that fixed her reputation for 3 centuries concerns Jeanne d'Albret, the Protestant Queen of Navarre, who came to Paris in 1572 to arrange her son's wedding and died there suddenly, weeks before the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day. The Huguenot presses knew immediately what had happened. Catherine, they printed, had sent her rival a gift of perfumed gloves, Italian gloves, naturally, dressed with poison. The tale had everything: the foreign queen, the scented luxury, the innocent victim, the timing. What it did not have, the autopsy suggested even then, and historians have concluded since, was truth. Jeanne d'Albret appears to have died of illness. Tuberculosis has long been the leading account. And the poison gloves survive only in the pamphlets of a propaganda war that needed Catherine monstrous. It mattered not at all. The gloves entered legend. The legend entered histories. Dumas gave it to millions as fiction. and Catherine de' Medici, poisoner, hardened into one of those facts that everyone knows and no one can cite. One plain sentence, and it is the chapter's verdict. The Italian art, as the rest of Europe imagined it, was mostly a mirror, a way for every court to dress its own ordinary ambitions and terrors in a foreign costume. And history's actual poison ledgers were being kept, all the while, in whatever city was doing the accusing. Still, smoke, fire, and all that. Strip away the Borgia opera and the gloves, and a residue of the real remains, the Venetian minutes, genuine trial records scattered across the peninsula's city-states, a Renaissance chemistry genuinely sophisticated enough to make the fears plausible. The knowledge existed. The market existed. What the legends got wrong was mainly the management. Less genius and midnight, more committee and fee schedule. And in the next century, in the grandest court in Europe, the committee and the fee schedule finally met the midnight legend face to face. When the police of Louis XIV pulled a thread in a fortune-teller's parlor and found, to their genuine horror, an entire industry on the other end. Love powders and inheritance powders sold over a very different kind of counter to some of the most glittering names at Versailles. It is the best documented poison panic in European history. It reached within arm's length of the throne, and the king ended it by burning the files. Next, Paris, the burning chamber, and the affair that taught Europe the customers were ordinary. Chapter 5. The Affair of the Poisons. Paris in the 1670s supported a thriving industry that has no tidy modern name. Its practitioners called themselves fortune-tellers, wise women, divineresses. Their parlors offered card readings and horoscopes at the front, and deeper in, a fuller catalog. Love philtres for the unhappily married, beauty waters, discreet remedies, seances, and, for select clients, at select prices, powders. The trade sat exactly where this series has taught you to look for trouble, on the unregulated shelf, in the gap between medicine, magic, and commerce, serving customers whose problems were real, even when the merchandise wasn't. Most of it was surely harmless fraud, colored water and cold reading. But at the top of the trade, the inventory was not colored water, and in 1676 Paris began, slowly, to find out. The finding out began, as it often does, with an aristocrat who got careless, the Marquise de Brinvilliers, well-born, well-married, and long rumored to have practiced on her own family, was arrested abroad, tried before the Parliament of Paris on the strength of her late lover's written confessions and her own extracted one, and executed that summer. We keep our camera, as promised, on the documents. What mattered historically was less the marquise than the trial's effect on the capital's imagination. Her case put on public record the idea that poisoning was not a foreign legend or a servant's crime, that it lived comfortably in the best houses. Paris, primed by a decade of rumors, began seeing powders everywhere. And the king's new chief of police, Nicolas de la Reynie, the sober, methodical administrator who essentially invented modern policing for the city, began pulling threads. A word about the man pulling the threads, because he is one of tonight's unsung heroes and the inventor of the stage he worked on. Nicolas de la Reynie held a post created for him in 1667, Lieutenant General of Police of Paris, the first time any great city had gathered its watching, lighting, cleaning, and investigating into one professional office. It was La Reynie who hung the streets of Paris with thousands of lanterns, block by block, year by year, until the city's nickname, La Ville Lumière, the City of Light, was simply a description of his budget. Take that in for a moment. The romantic epithet on 1,000,000 postcards began as a policing expenditure, and the man who lit the lamps did it, in part, so that the business conducted in the dark, including the business this chapter is about, would have fewer places to stand. When the poison affair broke, France discovered it possessed, for the first time in European history, exactly the instrument such an affair required: a methodical man with files, informants, jurisdiction, and patience. The affair of the poisons is remembered for its horrors. It should be remembered equally as the first great case ever worked by something recognizable as a modern police force. The lanterns and the ledgers, as usual in this series, turn out to be the same project. The thread that unraveled everything led to Catherine Monvoisin, called La Voisin, the most successful fortune teller in Paris, arrested in 1679. Her operation, as La Reynie's interrogations mapped it, was a business empire of the shadow shelf. Fortunes told, matches predicted, and for clients whose impatience exceeded their scruples, the graduation catalog, powders of love, and what the era came to call, with a court's talent for euphemism, poudre de succession, inheritance powders. Say the phrase slowly, because 17th century French society certainly did. Powder for the improvement of one's inheritance prospects. The euphemism is the confession, a market so established it had developed polite vocabulary. Louis XIV, informed of how high the clientele reached, did something both drastic and revealing. He created a special tribunal to handle the affair outside the ordinary courts. The Chambre Ardente, the burning chamber, an old name for an old institution. A courtroom hung in black and lit by torches even in daytime. For 3 years it sat, questioned hundreds, and sent, the count usually given, some 3 dozen to execution, La Voisin among them, with scores more imprisoned, exiled, or banished into fortress custody by royal order rather than verdict. And then the investigation reached the name it could not survive. Madame de Montespan, for a decade the king's official mistress, mother of his legitimized children, the most glittering woman at Versailles, accused by prisoners of having been across years a client of the deepest services on La Voisin's menu. Was she? Here the episode's method must simply be stated and obeyed. The testimony against her came from people questioned under torture or in fear of it, contradicting one another, bargaining for their lives, describing events years past. No court ever heard the charges, and the king closed the tribunal, sealed the most dangerous depositions, and in 1709, decades later, had the sealed file burned. Historians have argued the Monospon question for 3 centuries and will not stop, because the evidence is exactly as good as evidence extracted in a torchlit chamber can be, and no better. What we can say plainly is what the king's own actions said. The crown judged the affair too dangerous to be fully known and chose ash over answers. It is the most literal instance in tonight's story of history's poison record being written and unwritten by power. The police copies, as it happens, survived the bonfire. That is the only reason this chapter exists. Running underneath the whole French affair like a rumor under a floor was an older Italian name, Acqua Tofana. The story, as Europe told it, in Rome and Palermo, a generation earlier, a woman named Julia Tofana had supplied unhappy wives with a clear, tasteless water, sold, some versions insist, in vials disguised as devotional oil, that freed them from their husbands a few discreet doses at a time. Hundreds of men, the legend counts, perhaps 600, before she was caught. What does the record support? That poisoning prosecutions of this general shape occurred in 17th century Italy is documented. That a Tofana existed and gave her name to a feared preparation is widely accepted. But the details, the 600, the confession under torture, the tidy narrative arc, dissolve on inspection into exactly the mixture we have been handling all night. Late tellings, inflated numbers, moralized shape. The 600 is not a count. It is a shudder, wearing digits. And the legend's afterlife outdid even the Borgias. More than a century later, a dying Mozart reportedly told his wife he believed he had been given aqua tofana, a belief his own doctors did not share then, and no serious historian shares now. His final illness was documented, diagnosed in the ordinary miserable terms of his century, and involved no poisoner whatsoever. But observe the mechanism, because it is the night's recurring machine. A name coined in one century becomes the explanation of first resort in the next, applied confidently to any death that feels too significant to be ordinary. Poison legends survive because they offer what ordinary mortality refuses: a villain, a vial, and a reason. Ordinary death asks to be grieved. Poisoned death asks only to be solved. And grief will take the second bargain every time it is offered. One plain sentence before we leave Paris, and it is the affair's true legacy. What horrified Europe was not the existence of poisoners, but the discovery of the customer list. Ordinary ladies, courtiers, respectable names, buying hope and malice in bottles from the same parlor that told their fortunes. The lesson every government drew was the lesson this series has watched assemble for 2 episodes. The shelf cannot police its buyers. The state must police the shelf. France tightened its edicts on the sale of poisons and the licensing of apothecaries within a few years of the tribunal's closing. The idea of the regulated substance, known sellers, known buyers, written records, was growing up, statute by statute, exactly in the shadow of these panics. It would be needed as never before in the century that followed, because the next great poison was not a secret at all. No legend, no Italian name, no fortune-teller's back room. It sat in the open, on the counter of every chemist shop in Europe, next to the tea and the laudanum, a penny a packet, sold for the rats. The age of the professional poisoner was ending. The age of the household poison, democratic, industrial, and very nearly perfect for the purpose, was about to begin. Chapter 6: The Arsenic Century. Walk back into the Victorian chemist's shop, our shop, the one from the laudanum chapter of our last episode, and look again at the counter. There's the tea, there are the penny bottles, and there beside them, in paper packets stacked like sugar, is the other bestseller, arsenic. White arsenic, the oxide of a gray metalloid element, mined and refined by the ton as a byproduct of the metal trades and sold. This is the fact the whole chapter stands on. To anyone, for pennies, no questions asked, in every chemist's and grocer's and village shop in the industrial world. It killed the rats, and the 19th century had rats to spare. A house without arsenic in it was, for much of the century, simply an unusual house, and the age did not stop at the rat powder. Through one of history's most instructive accidents of chemistry, arsenic compounds made magnificent pigments. Above all, Scheele's green and its successors, the vivid emerald that became the signature color of the age. It went into wallpaper by the millions of rolls glowing on parlor walls. It went into dress fabrics. There were seasons when a fashionable ballroom shimmered with arsenical green. It went into candles, toys, artificial flowers, the coloring of confectionery. There were sweets for children tinted with it, and periodic catastrophes when a confectioner's supplier mixed up his white powders at scale. Medical journals of the era carried a steady drumbeat of alarm. Reports of families sickening in green-papered rooms, of flower makers with ulcerated hands, of the wallpaper question debated for decades. Was it flaking dust? Was it damp walls breathing something off the paper? The Victorians, understand, were not ignorant of arsenic's nature. They had simply built it into the furniture faster than they could regulate it out. If our first episode's lesson was that the age swallowed its medicine trustingly, this chapter's is stranger. The age decorated with its poison and lived inside the decoration. By the 1870s and 80s, the alarm had gone thoroughly mainstream. Physicians ordering sick rooms stripped of their green paper on suspicion alone. Manufacturers advertising arsenic-free wallpapers as a selling point, the way a later age would advertise sugar-free. and the whole affair conducted, characteristically, by market and mortification rather than by any general ban. The century regulated its rat powder and merely embarrassed its wallpaper, a distinction some historian of our own era's habits will no doubt savor in turn. A word here about the emperor, because someone at every fireside asks. Napoleon died in 1821 in a damp house on St. Helena with analysis of preserved samples much later showed measurable arsenic in his hair, and the walls of his rooms had been papered green. A theory duly flourished. The wallpaper, or worse, a poisoner. The sober consensus, resting on the autopsy performed at the time, is that he died of stomach cancer, the disease that had killed his father. The arsenic in his world, in wallpapers, medicines, hair preparations, the general Victorian atmosphere, needs no assassin to explain its traces. We file the wallpaper theory where we filed the gloves and the canarella, with the one concession honesty allows. Given that room, the wallpaper certainly didn't help. Now to the darker ledger, and we will hold it, as promised, at the ledger's distance. Everything that made arsenic the age's household staple made it, by the same properties, the age's criminal instrument of choice. Cheap beyond suspicion, obtainable everywhere by anyone, effectively tasteless, and most terribly, productive of an illness that the medicine of the day could not tell from the gastric fevers and choleras that were everywhere already. A poisoning could pass, and clearly sometimes did pass, as one more sad Tuesday in a century full of them. How often? Here honest history shrugs alongside the Victorian coroner. The undetected cases are, by definition, uncounted. What is counted is the panic. By the 1840s, England was frightening itself with the secret poisoning question. Newspapers tallying arsenic trials, pamphleteers warning of an epidemic in the cottages, particular anxiety swirling, with the era's full misogyny engaged, around wives, servants, and the burial clubs, the penny insurance societies of the poor, where a small weekly subscription paid out funeral money, and where a suspicious imagination could see a motive in every membership. Modern historians reading the record find the panic vastly outran the proven cases. The pattern you now know by heart. Fear is always better documented than crime. But the fear was doing structural work, and one plain sentence gives the era its due. Whatever the true count, the age had armed every household in the land with an undetectable weapon and was shocked at intervals of roughly one sensational trial per year, to discover that some households had used it. The century's arsenic ledger also carries entries stranger than crime, and one accidental catastrophe that changed the law, and both belong here. The strangeness first. Medical journals of the 1850s carried astonished reports of the arsenic eaters of Styria, alpine peasants who, by their own cheerful account and their neighbors' testimony, took arsenic regularly on purpose for complexion and wind in amounts that ought to have been unsurvivable and appeared to thrive. The reports were doubted, investigated, partially confirmed, and argued over for 50 years, and the phenomenon remains a footnote toxicologists poke at warily to this day. Mithridates, you notice, had returned wearing lederhosen, the old dream of the armored body, alive and well in the age of chemistry. And then, in 1858, the accident. In Bradford, a sweetsmaker supplier, filling an order for the cheap plaster stuff used to stretch sugar, drew from the wrong cask, arsenic instead, and a market stall's worth of peppermint humbugs went out into a Yorkshire Sunday. Around 20 people died, hundreds sickened, and England was treated to the spectacle of a mass poisoning with no poisoner at all, only casks, carelessness, and a supply chain, with nothing standing guard inside it. The Bradford tragedy did more than a decade of panic pamphlets to push adulteration and pharmacy law forward. It sits in the direct ancestry of the 1868 Act we keep meeting. The era's true villain. The accident kept insisting was not the poisoner, it was the unguarded shelf. The response, when it came, is one of this series' quiet hinges. In 1851, Parliament passed the Sale of Arsenic Regulation Act. Arsenic could no longer be sold to a stranger. The buyer must be known to the seller or vouched for. The sale must be entered in a book. The purchaser's name, address, occupation, the quantity, the stated purpose, with signatures. And arsenic sold in quantity for household use had to be mixed with soot or indigo, deliberately dirtied, blackened, or blued so that no one could ever again mistake it or pass it off as flour or sugar. Sit with the strangeness and the sense of that, the state reaching into a white powder and staining it visible. And the book. You have met the book. This is the poison register, the ledger we found on the counter in our apothecary episode and watched digitize itself into the monitoring systems of our opium episode. 1851 is where its arsenic page begins. 17 years before the Great Pharmacy Act of 1868 gathered the whole poison shelf into schedules and put the chemist's signature beside the customer's. One footnote from the original debates, preserved like a fly in amber. An early draft proposed restricting arsenic purchases to men only, so thoroughly had the panic gendered itself, before wiser heads settled for the register. The law, like the era, was frightened of poisoners in petticoats. The ledger, more sensibly, simply recorded everyone. And here the chapter must confess its limit, which is the century's limit. The register recorded the sale. The coloring marked the powder. But if the deed was done, if the illness in the back bedroom was not gastric fever after all, the law of 1851 had nothing to offer the coroner but a list of who had bought what. The gap that had run under every chapter tonight, under Athens, under Rome, under Venice and Versailles, was still open. No one could look into the quiet body and prove the poison there. Every regulation so far guarded the front door of the crime. The back door, the grave, stayed shut to evidence. It was the oldest lock in this entire story. And in a workshop in Woolwich, in the 1830s, an irritable, underpaid chemist named James Marsh, smarting from a courtroom humiliation we will hear all about, was building the key. Chapter 7. The Chemist Catches Up. Every detective story has the scene where the detective finally arrives. In the 4,000-year story of poison, the detective arrives in this chapter, wearing, fittingly for this series, a chemist's apron. He had forerunners and one towering one. Mathieu Orfila, a Spanish-born physician who came to Paris young and in 1814 published the Traité des Poisons, the treatise generally honored as the founding work of toxicology as a science. Orfila's program sounded simple and was revolutionary. Stop reasoning about poisons from symptoms and stories and study them as chemistry, systematically, in the laboratory, with methods a second chemist could repeat and a courtroom could trust. He became the great medical legal authority of France, the man the hard cases were sent to. But a science is only as strong as its instruments, and the instrument the courts needed most, a reliable way to demonstrate arsenic in a human body, plainly enough to convince 12 laymen, did not yet exist. The tests of the day were fragile, finicky, prone to ambiguous colors and vanishing residues, which brings us to the humiliation. In 1832, an English chemist named James Marsh, a skilled, chronically under-rewarded man who worked at the Woolwich Arsenal, was called to assist the prosecution of a man accused of poisoning his grandfather's coffee. Marsh ran the standard test, obtained the telltale result, and then watched his crucial sample deteriorate before it could do its work on the jury, who acquitted. The accused, it may complete the story to know, is reported to have confessed at leisure years later, safely beyond retrial. Marsh took the acquittal personally, as only a proud craftsman can, and spent his spleen productively. 4 years later, in 1836, he published the apparatus that bears his name. The Marsh tests, and here is all the chemistry this fireside requires, could take material in which arsenic was utterly invisible, and through a small glass apparatus, a chemist could operate on a courtroom table, deliver the arsenic out the far end as a dark metallic film on porcelain. The arsenic mirror, a stain of the element itself, visible, stable, weighable, showable, sensitive to almost absurd degrees, repeatable at will before judges in daylight. After 4,000 years, the quiet body could be made to speak, and what it said could be shown to a jury. The demonstration that taught all Europe this new fact of life came 4 years later in France, in the trial the whole world watched, the Lafarge affair. Charles Lafarge, a foundry owner in rural Corrèze, died in January 1840 after weeks of illness. His young Parisian wife, Marie, married to him by arrangement, unhappily only months before, was accused of dosing his food with arsenic she had bought on the register for the rats. The case had everything the newspapers could wish, and France divided into warring camps over her guilt as though over a religion. But what makes Lafarge matter to this series is what happened with the science. The local experts ran the old tests on the exhumed remains and contradicted one another. Positive, negative, positive again. A shambles of methods. The defense summoned the authority of authorities, and Orfila himself came down from Paris. Before the assembled court, Orfila reran the analysis with the Marsh apparatus, correctly and completely, and demonstrated arsenic in the body. Arsenic. He took care to show with controls that had not come from the graveyard soil, nor from the reagents, nor from anywhere but where it was found. Marie Lafarge was convicted. She maintained her innocence to the end of her life, and, in the finest tradition of every case this episode has touched, the arguments have never entirely stopped, but the verdict that mattered beyond her courtroom was rendered on the method. Forensic toxicology had stood up in the most scrutinized trial in Europe, under hostile examination and held. Every poisoner in Europe who could read a newspaper now knew something new and terrible. The grave had become a witness stand. It is worth lingering a moment on what Orfila's controls actually answered, because the objection he had to kill was a clever one, and killing it is half the reason he owns the title of founder. The defense chemists at Lafarge and skeptics across Europe pressed the obvious doubts. Might arsenic occur naturally in human bodies? Might it creep into a coffin from cemetery earth? Might the reagents themselves, as the Smethurst affair would soon demonstrate so mortifyingly, bring their own contamination to the party? Orfila had spent years running precisely those experiments, analyzing soils from the graveyards in question, testing bodies dead of undisputed natural causes, assaying his own zinc and acids before trusting them. His answers: graveyard soil could indeed hold arsenic, which is exactly why one tested it. Uncontaminated tissue showed none by his methods, and every reagent must first prove itself innocent. Read today like the table of contents of a forensic chemistry syllabus, which is more or less what they became. The deep lesson of 1840 wasn't that a clever apparatus existed. It was that an argument now existed, evidence with its alternatives excluded, one by one in public. And that is the thing a courtroom had never before been offered on this subject in 4,000 years. Science being science, the triumph came with a lesson in humility bolted on, and honesty requires we tell it. In 1859 in England, a doctor named Smethurst was convicted of poisoning largely on the strength of a positive arsenic finding by the eminent analyst of the day, who then had to admit the dreadful truth. His apparatus itself had been contaminated. The test had, in effect, supplied its own arsenic. The conviction collapsed in scandal and pardon. The new science learned, early and in public, the rule that governs every laboratory to this hour. The instrument that can hang a defendant must be cleaner than the crime. Forensics grew up in that embarrassment. Blanks, controls, purity of reagents, the whole liturgy of the modern lab, and was the stronger for having been caught young. Step back and watch what these 2 decades did to our long story, because this is the hinge of the entire episode. For 4,000 years, the poisoner's great ally had been silence. The illness that looked ordinary, the grave that kept its counsel, the accusation that could never be settled and so settled on whoever was easiest to accuse. The Marsh test and the discipline Orfila built around it ended the silence. Not all at once, and never perfectly, but the presumption flipped. The arsenic that had been the perfect instrument precisely because it left no story, now left the most durable story of all. A metallic signature, recoverable years after burial, demonstrable to laymen at a glance. Prosecutions sharpened the golden age of the household poisoner. Historians use the phrase, always with the dates ending mid-century, closed within a generation. And notice, with some satisfaction, who closed it. Not a detective with a revolver, but chemists. Men of the same laboratory tradition, the same glassware, the same shelf. As every apothecary and pharmacist, this series is celebrated. The knowledge that had always cut both ways was finally sharpened on the side of the catching. The pharmacon had grown a conscience with instruments. 2 footnotes closed the chapter, one for the science and one for the man. The science. Arsenic was only the first door. In 1850, a Belgian chemist named Jean Servais Stas, working the murder case of a count who had used nicotine precisely because everyone knew plant alkaloids vanished in the body, developed the extraction method that proved they didn't. And with that, the poisoner's last redoubt, the vegetable poisons, began to fall to the laboratory as the mineral ones had. By the century's end, the analyst's reach covered most of the classical arsenal, and the strychnine and morphine of the coming chapter's villains would be found and weighed as routinely as arsenic. And the man, James Marsh, whose little apparatus reset the balance of an ancient war, was rewarded by his era about as generously as you have come to expect from the series' treatment of its quiet benefactors, a society's medal, a modest gratuity, and a workbench at Woolwich until his death. His family left to petition for support afterward. The test carried his name into every courtroom in Europe. The name carried rather less back. We light our fire for him tonight regardless. He would recognize the gesture. Small, warm, and insufficient. But do not relax entirely, because the century had one more genre of villain in stock, and it is the one this series finds hardest to forgive. The Marsh test could catch arsenic. The register could log the stranger at the counter. Neither was designed for the poisoner who needed no counter at all, who carried the whole dark shelf legitimately in a black leather bag into the sick room with the family's grateful blessing. The next chapter belongs to the poisoners with medical degrees and to the technologies, legal and otherwise, that finally cornered even them. Chapter 8. The Doctor Will See You Now. Every institution in the series runs on one commodity, and it is not medicine. It is trust. The whole apparatus we have spent 4 episodes building. The shop, the counter, the register, the white coat, is a machine for making it safe to swallow what a stranger hands you. Which is why the century that finally armed itself against poisoners reserved its deepest horror for the smallest category of them. The ones who came in through the front door with a medical bag, invited. The case that fixed the type in the public mind was William Palmer of Rugeley, a Staffordshire doctor in practice among his own neighbors, and a catastrophic gambler on the horses. Around him, across the early 1850s, an actuarially improbable number of people died. Creditors, relations, And finally, in 1855, his racing companion John Parsons Cook, who fell ill after a celebration and died with Palmer in attendance. Attending, the prosecution would note rather too energetically, including involving himself with the post-mortem samples. The finances told their own story. Palmer was drowning in forged paper and insurance policies written on the lives around him. He was charged with poisoning Cook with strychnine. The trial in 1856 was the sensation of the age, and it matters to tonight for 3 reasons, all of them structural. First, public feeling in Staffordshire ran so hot that Parliament passed a special statute, the Central Criminal Court Act of 1856, known ever since as Palmer's Act, allowing the trial to be moved to London's Old Bailey for fairness. The case reshaped the law's own furniture before a verdict was ever reached. Second, the science was contested in exactly the way last chapter taught you to watch for. The analysts found no strychnine in the samples. The prosecution argued from symptoms and circumstances. The defense hammered the absence, and the greatest chemical names of the day disagreed in public. Palmer was convicted on the whole picture, the clinical course, the purchases, the ledger of motive, and hanged before an enormous crowd, and the debate about the chemistry ran on for decades in a way that would embarrass no modern courtroom, where the toxicology has grown incomparably finer. Third, and this is the reason he is in tonight's episode, Palmer taught the century that the register and the Marsh test, mighty as they were, had a blind spot the exact shape of a professional man. He needed no false name at the counter. He was the counter. The defenses the age had built all faced outward, toward the stranger. The doctor stood inside them. Palmer's afterlife and folklore, incidentally, outgrew even his trial, and 2 specimens deserve this fireside. The barroom question, "What's your poison?" is sometimes traced to his era's gallows humor, plausibly but unprovably, as such etymologies usually are. We file it with the smoke that wasn't blown. Better still is the tale that the town of Rugeley, mortified at its new fame, petitioned to change its name, and was told by the Prime Minister that it might, provided it renamed itself after him. Palmerston. The story is almost certainly a Victorian joke that hardened into fact through sheer retelling. No record supports it. But notice that it is, structurally, a poison legend about a poison legend, and by this point in the evening you can dismantle it in your sleep, which by all means feel free to be doing. Brighton, 1871, supplied the counter's own nightmare in miniature. Christiana Edmonds, obsessed with a local physician, took to obtaining chocolate creams from a fashionable confectioner, dosing them with strychnine bought on the register with borrowed pretexts, and returning them to the shop's stock for resale. A child died. The town panicked. The poisoned goods were for once literally on the shelf. She was found insane and confined for life. We give the case 1 paragraph and this single observation. It was the register that traced her purchases and helped end it. The boring ledger, doing exactly the boring work it was built for, 1 signature at a time. The system, young as it was beginning to hold. And it held, note well, against an attack aimed at its most sensitive point. The public's faith that what the shop sells is what the shop says. And then there is the case with the wireless, the one where the 19th century's poison story sails literally into the 20th. Hawley Harvey Crippen, American-born, a seller of patent remedies, our first episode's industry, making its darkest cameo. With medical credentials of the ambiguous transatlantic sort, lived in North London with his wife, the music hall performer Belle Elmore. In early 1910 she vanished. Crippen said she had gone to America and died there. His young companion, Ethel Leneve, moved in and was seen in Belle's furs and jewelry. Scotland Yard's Inspector Walter Dew called, searched, found nothing, and might have closed the file had Crippen's nerve held. It did not. He and Leneve fled. The house was searched again, and remains were found under the cellar floor. The toxicology laboratories, by now a mature institution, the direct descendants of Orfila's program, reported hyoscine, a sedative alkaloid of the nightshade family. The pharmacy record showed Crippen's purchase, duly signed for, in the poison register. Every institution this episode has built converged on one cellar. What happened next made the case immortal. Crippen and Leneve, she disguised unconvincingly as a boy, had boarded the liner Montrose for Canada. Her captain, studying the odd pair, grew certain and used the ship's brand-new Marconi wireless apparatus to telegraph his suspicion to London while still at sea. Dew boarded a faster ship, crossed the Atlantic ahead of them, and came aboard from the pilot boat in the St. Lawrence to make the arrest, the first celebrated capture by radio in history, followed breathlessly by newspaper readers who, for the first time ever, could watch a manhunt unfold across an ocean in something like real time. The era's newest net had closed around the era's oldest crime. Crippen was convicted and hanged. Leneve was acquitted. And in the spirit of every verdict tonight, we append the modern footnote plainly. A century later, DNA analysis of surviving tissue samples led some researchers to question whether the cellar remains were Belle's at all. Findings other scientists dispute on chain of custody and methodological grounds, with the argument continuing in the journals. We take no side at this hour of the night. We note only, with a certain awe, that the Crippen case is still on the bench being tested, which is, when you think about it, the whole moral of this episode wearing a single case's name. The century of proof does not close its files. That is what makes it the century of proof. One plain sentence for the chapter's ledger, and then the profession's answer. Medical poisoners were vanishingly rare, a handful of names in a century of tens of thousands of honest practitioners, but each one detonated something no ordinary criminal could touch. The presumption of the bedside, the whole compact this series runs on. And the response, assembled case by case across these decades, is recognizably the world you live in now. Registration of practitioners with real teeth behind it, prescription-only classes of dangerous drugs, records that follow the professional and not merely the customer, death certification tightened, the analyst's laboratory standing permanently behind the coroner. The counter, having learned that danger could wear its own coat, taught itself to watch itself, and if that sentence sounds familiar, it should. It is the Rose case's professional bargain from our apothecary episode, renewed under harder terms. Trust in medicine. was never the absence of suspicion. It is suspicion, institutionalized, wearing a calm face. By 1910, then, the poisoner's world had been enclosed from every side but one. The chemist could find the poison in the body, the register could name the buyer, the wireless could outrun the fleeing suspect. What remained, the last open flank in this 4,000-year siege, was the oldest and least dramatic one of all: the accident. The child at the unlocked cupboard, the tired reach for the wrong bottle in the dark, the carbolic acid on the same shelf as the cough syrup. No villain, no trial, just the shelf itself and human fingers and the dark. The final movement of tonight's story is how the shelf was redesigned to protect people from the shelf. And it begins, of all places, with the shape of a bottle. Chapter 9. Skulls, Bells, and Green Bottles. Hold a Victorian poison bottle in your mind's hand for a moment. The museums and the collectors' cabinets are full of them, and they are, against all decency, beautiful. The glass is colored, deep cobalt blue, or a green the shade of bottle flies in envy. The shape is wrong, deliberately, hexagonal where medicine bottles were round, or ribbed with hard vertical flutes, or knobbed and studded like a tiny Gothic building. Across the face, embossed in the glass itself, standing proud enough to read with a thumbnail, "Not to be taken." Some carry the skull and crossbones. The extravagant patents of the era went further still. Bottles shaped as skulls, bottles shaped as coffins, bottles with bells in them. The century prototyped every warning an object can give short of speaking. Now ask why, and the answer is the whole chapter, and it is a lovely one. The bottle was designed for the dark. Picture the household it served, a cottage or a terrace house. One room, gas unlit or unaffordable, a sick child coughing at 2 a.m, and a shelf on which the cough mixture and the liniment and the laudanum and the carbolic and the rat powder all stood together, because the poor do not have spare rooms for their chemistry. A wrong bottle in that dark was a death no register could prevent, no villain anywhere in it, only fatigue and bad light. The Victorian pharmacy's answer was to make danger legible to the fingers. Reach half asleep toward the wrong bottle and your hand reads ridges, knurls, the hard hexagonal shoulders. A texture that means stop, wake up, light the lamp. The embossing meant the label still spoke after the paper one soaked off. The colored glass flagged it by daylight. The fluting flagged it by feel at midnight. It is Braille for danger, decades before Braille reached the medicine shelf by law. And it is, we will argue at this fireside, one of the most humane objects the 19th century ever mass-produced. A bottle that assumes you are exhausted, assumes the light is bad, assumes mistakes are human, and builds the warning into the thing itself instead of blaming you afterward. The poison book itself, in this era, settles into the form the collectors now treasure: printed columns, ruled faint, a page a day in a busy shop, date, name, address, quantity, purpose, the purchaser's signature, and the witnesses, line after line of rats, and for the garden in copperplate and scrawl. Historians read them now the way archaeologists read middens. Whole neighborhoods' anxieties, one signature at a time. And the surviving bottles have become, in the fullness of time, a gentle irony of the antiques trade, the century's most feared glass, lovingly collected, displayed in lit cabinets by people who find them beautiful, which they always were. Danger, sufficiently outlived, becomes decor. There may be no kinder measure of the system's eventual success. The shop around the bottle learned the same grammar. The poison cupboard, locked, its key on the chemist's own ring. The poison drawer set apart from the ordinary drawers, and in many shops, by sturdy tradition, rigged so it could not be opened quietly. A bell or a clatter mounted on it, so that reaching into the dangerous drawer rang, and every assistant in the shop turned round. How universal the bell truly was, the trade histories debate. That shops used such tricks, separations, locks, deliberate awkwardness, is solid, and the idea is the point. Friction, engineered on purpose, exactly where fingers meet danger. Statute stiffened all of it. The 1868 Act's schedules prescribed how poisons must be labeled, colored, sold, and by whom. The word poison itself, in set type, on set colors. The registers we have followed for 3 episodes now flanked by physical law. The shelf's honesty enforced in glass and lettering. Apprentices learn the geography of danger as a physical drill before they learn the chemistry of it. Which drawer never sits beside which bottles never share a shelf with the syrups, which transfers demand a second pair of eyes. The choreography of the shop rearranged permanently around the worst 5% of its stock. A customer at the counter in 1890 saw none of this and was protected by all of it, which is the definition of the system working. And in America, the same decades built the same architecture through the state boards of pharmacy. And then, you have heard this sentence before in 2 prior episodes, and it remains the best sentence in the era, through the Federal Act of 1906, after which the label had to tell the truth. Dr. Wiley and his poison squad take their one-line bow here and retire. We told their story in episode 1, and tonight it is enough to note what they completed. By the early 20th century, in glass, in type, in schedule, and in law, the shelf had learned to confess. And the same shelf held a paradox the design had to accommodate, because this series never lets a century keep its categories tidy. Arsenic was also a medicine, dispensed daily on purpose by the very chemists dyeing the rat powder black. Fowler's solution, a preparation of arsenic dating from the 1780s, sat in the pharmacopoeia for the better part of 2 centuries, prescribed for skin conditions, for fevers, for anemia, tonic drops measured out with the same care as any remedy on the friendly shelves. Whole generations took their arsenic from the doctor's hand, while the courts hanged people for administering it unofficially. The bottle conventions grew subtler to match. The trade settled into color and texture codes for the externals. the liniments and lotions never meant for swallowing, so that blue fluted glass came to mean, in the finger language of the shop, for the skin, not the mouth. Meanwhile, the century's other household terror, carbolic acid, the disinfectant of the germ theory age, kept in kitchens by the gallon and tragically easy to mistake for something drinkable, filled the accident columns of the newspapers so reliably that its regulation became a cause in itself, pushing poison scheduling forward the way Bradford's humbugs had. Look at what the shop had become by 1900. Not two shelves, one safe and one deadly, but a single graded landscape of risk, annotated in glass. Ridges for the poisons, blue for the externals, locks for the worst, labels sworn to honesty, the pharmacon rendered as an entire information system you could read with your fingertips by candlelight. Spend one quiet minute before the chapter closes on what all this design actually is, because it is easy to file under quaintness, and it deserves better. Every ridge on that green bottle is an apology and a promise, an admission, molded in glass, that the previous arrangement, smooth bottles, honest hopes, blame for the grieving, had been a failure of imagination, and a promise that the shelf would henceforth carry part of the burden of care itself. This is the same moral technology as the taster's credenza and the arsenic register, matured by 3 centuries. The recognition that safety cannot live in vigilance alone because vigilance sleeps. It must be built into objects which don't. The modern world runs on this idea so completely that it has become invisible. The shape-coded, color-coded, guarded and gated everything of contemporary life is the Victorian poison bottle's descendants, uncountable and unthanked. Design, it turns out, is the only member of the household who is awake at 2 in the morning. The 19th century learned to leave the warnings with it. And yet, one gap left, and you have perhaps already seen it, because this series has trained you well. The ridged bottle warns the finger that can read it. The lock defeats the hand that cannot reach the key. But there was one member of the household for whom the ridges were a toy, the skull a pirate flag, the bright green bottle the most interesting object in the room, who could not read not to be taken and would not have obeyed it, and whose reach, year by year, grew. The final chapter of tonight's story, the one your narrator finds genuinely moving, the one with the happiest numbers in the whole 4,000 years, is about protecting the smallest hands in the house. It involves a phone number taped to a refrigerator, a green face sticking out its tongue, and a plastic cap that every adult listening has cursed at least once. And it is the chapter where the death toll, after 40 centuries of rising, finally, measurably, magnificently falls. Chapter 10. The Antidote Age. The 20th century did something with poison that no century before it had managed, or honestly even attempted. It made the subject boring. Institutional, procedural, staffed around the clock, And in this series, as you know by now, boring is the highest compliment history can pay. Boring means solved enough to schedule. This chapter is the story of poison control becoming somebody's day job and of the numbers that fell because it did. Start with the scale of the problem the century inherited. The modern home, by mid-century, held more chemistry than a Renaissance apothecary's whole shop. Cleaners, solvents, medicines, pesticides, cosmetics, the bright bottles under every sink. And the group exploring it most energetically was, as it has always been, children under 5. The pediatric journals of the 1940s and 50s carry the weary arithmetic. Poisoning as one of the standing accidents of childhood. Tens of thousands of frightened phone calls with nowhere organized to ring. Doctors improvising answers from memory at midnight. And a steady, unbearable tithe of small funerals, with one product, flavored children's aspirin, sitting notoriously at the top of the tables. Our last episode gave aspirin its birth scene beside heroin in 1897. Here's the other half of its biography. The wonder drug of the family medicine chest was also, by sheer ubiquity and a taste children liked, the leading agent of their accidental poisoning, the pharmacon, fluent as ever in irony. The first answer was information, organized. In 1953 in Chicago, physicians and pharmacists opened what is generally counted the first poison control center, essentially a staffed library with a telephone. Card files on thousands of products and their ingredients, antidote protocols. Someone competent awake at all hours. The idea spread the way good, boring ideas do, city by city, then everywhere, and matured, decades on, into a national network reachable through a single number. In the United States, one line for the whole country since the early 2000s, fielding millions of calls a year. The overwhelming majority resolved, mark this, at home, with reassurance and instructions, no hospital required. Pin that institution among the heroes of the whole series and notice who has always been thick on its staff. Pharmacists. The poison specialist answering the 2 a.m. call about what a toddler just ate is the direct professional descendant of every figure the series has honored. Dioscorides testing the label's claim, the muctasib checking the shelf, the chemist with the ledger, the counter, gone nocturnal and toll-free. Then came the era's genuinely original insight, and it wore a green face. The skull and crossbones, it turned out, had a fatal design flaw. Children liked it. Pirates, by the 1960s, meant cartoons and adventure. Research at Pittsburgh's Poison Center found the old symbol could attract exactly the audience it existed to repel. So in 1971, they engineered a replacement scientifically, testing faces on children until they found the one small children reliably disliked. A scrunched, nauseated, lurid green face, tongue out, Mr. Yuck, whose stickers carried the Poison Center's number and whose entire career is the design lesson of the last chapter taken one step further. A warning must be legible not to the shelf's owner, but to its most vulnerable reader. The Victorians wrote, not to be taken for hands that could read English by touch. Pittsburgh wrote yuck in the universal language of the disgusted face, for readers aged 2. The era's science, it should be said, kept revising itself in public, in the honest manner last chapter taught us to admire, and the kitchen shelf followed along. For decades, the standing advice put a small brown bottle of syrup of ipecac in every family medicine chest. Ipecacuana, the South American emetic root you last met riding beside opium in Dover's powder in our opium episode, kept on hand so that a household could act at once on the poison center's instruction before help arrived. Millions of homes stocked it. It was, for a generation, the very emblem of prepared parenthood. And then the evidence came in, study by study, that routine emesis was helping less and complicating more than anyone had assumed. And around the turn of the century, the pediatric authorities formally reversed course, advising the bottles emptied and the reflex retired in favor of one act: call the number. Note what that reversal is, because it is the whole episode in miniature. Not a scandal, but a system updating. The poison shelf governed by now, not by legend or panic or habit, but by evidence willing to correct itself out loud. 4,000 years of this story, and that willingness is the rarest artifact in it. And then the masterpiece. In the small city of Windsor, Ontario, a pediatrician named Henri Brault, who had spent years pumping the stomachs of aspirin-poisoned children and refused to accept the arithmetic, championed a cap for medicine bottles that adults could open and small children, reliably, could not. The Palm and Turn, introduced locally in 1967. Windsor's childhood poisoning admissions dropped so steeply, so immediately, that the idea became unanswerable. The United States followed at national scale with the Poison Prevention Packaging Act of 1970, mandating child-resistant closures on aspirin, prescription drugs, and the dangerous household chemistry, category by category. The results belong among the great quiet triumphs of public health. Aspirin deaths among young children, dozens upon dozens a year in the bad decades, fell away toward a rarity, and childhood poisoning fatalities as a class collapsed across the 1970s and 80s. By margins, public health measures rarely achieve outside vaccination. Exact accountings vary by substance and study. Mike will keep our numbers honest, but the direction and the steepness are not in dispute. Every adult listening has stood in a kitchen wrestling one of those caps and muttering, "Hear this," and mutter more fondly. That small nightly defeat of your thumbs is a monument. It is the arsenic register and the ridged bottle and the locked cupboard, miniaturized into plastic, distributed to every household in the civilized world. Friction, engineered with love, exactly where the smallest fingers meet the oldest danger. So gather the whole 4,000 years in one place, the way we like to do before the fire burns down. Athens could measure a poison but not prove one. The kings hid behind tasters and unicorn horns. Rome wrote the law and burned the reputations. The Renaissance kept the legends, and in Venice, the minutes. Paris discovered the customers were ordinary. The Arsenic Age armed every cottage and then, in a picture frame shop in Woolwich, forged the mirror that ended the silence. The doctors who betrayed the bedside taught the professions to watch themselves. The green-ridged bottles taught objects to stand guard, and the 20th century staffed the night shift, stickered the bottles under the sink, and put a cap on the aspirin that finally bent the oldest curve in this story downward. Not one hero anywhere in it with a sword. Chemists, pharmacists, pediatricians, legislators, designers of bottles, and tellers of truth on labels. The detective story we promised you has this for its solution. The poisoners lose, not to a rival genius, but to bookkeeping, to registers and reagent blanks and phone lines and plastic caps, to a civilization that decided, one boring statute at a time, that the dark half of the shelf would be watched by systems that do not sleep, and the dark bed of the garden where we began tonight, still growing, every plant of it. Medicine never did throw it out. It learned instead to garden it. The foxglove that stops hearts steadies them now by the measured milligram, as digoxin. Belladonna's atropine rides in the crash carts, an antidote named for the fate with the shears. Even Arsenic, the villain of our longest chapter, was recruited, within living memory, into medicine's own ranks. A refined arsenic compound is today a standard life-saving treatment for a rare leukemia, administered with exactly the reverence you would expect. 4,000 years, and the lesson at the bottom of the last green bottle is the one the Greeks filed inside the word before this series had a name for itself. There was never a shelf of medicines and a shelf of poisons. There was one shelf all along, and the entire history of pharmacy, every register and ridge and lock and cap and quiet professional in the series, is the long, patient, unfinished art of holding it with both hands. The cupboard is locked. The bell hasn't rung all night, and that, dear listener, is very nearly the whole story, which means it is time to put out the lamp. Come back through the shop with me one last time, slowly, past the counter with its brass scale, asleep on its own balance, past the friendly shelves, the syrups, the liver pills, the jars with their painted Latin promises, which look, you'll notice, a little friendlier than they did 2 hours ago, now that you know how hard-won their friendliness was. The green bottles are behind their glass, ribbed and glinting, keeping their counsel. The book is closed on the counter, today's last signature drying. Turn the key in the poison cupboard, feel it seat with that solid, satisfied click, and hang the ring by the door. None of it will be on the test. The hemlock and the philosopher's rooster, the credenza hiding in your dining room. The king who armored himself so well, the armor betrayed him. The empresses convicted by gossip, and the queens convicted by gloves. The committee minutes in Venice, and the burned files of Versailles. The penny arsenic dyed with soot. The irritable chemist and his mirror of proof. The wireless message running ahead of the fleeing doctor, the bottles that learn to speak to fingers, and the caps that learn to refuse the smallest ones. 4,000 years of the dark half of the shelf, and it ends with a phone number on a refrigerator and a green face sticking out its tongue. History has ended on far worse. If you're still awake, we admire your constitution, and the fire has a little life in it yet. If you're somewhere between half in this shop, half in your own quiet room, that's exactly where you should be. Nothing here can reach you. It never could, really. That was the whole point of the locks and the ledgers and the long vigilance of the people in the white coats, who are, at this hour, asleep themselves. The night watch handed over to the systems that don't sleep, and to the little bell on the drawer, which has nothing to report. The lamp is out. The street is quiet. The rest, as always, is history. Good night.